It's 1942, the North African desert. Between 1941 and 43, three generals passed through this theatre, one after another, their careers overlapping in the same sand, fighting the same war. And the mythology surrounding all three will outlive the conflict by 80 years. One is called the Desert Fox, a name his enemies gave him. One carries ivory-handled revolvers and speaks about himself in the third person. And one is reportedly asked which three generals he admires most, and answers, the other two would be Alexander the Great and Napoleon. That last one isn't a joke. It's attributed to Montgomery, and knowing him, it's entirely believable. Here's the problem. All three of these men are remembered as legends, military geniuses, the kind of commanders who win wars by sheer force of brilliance. But when you strip away the mythology, the movies, the books, the 30 years of History Channel reruns, and look at what each of them actually accomplished versus what they had to work with, a different picture emerges. One of these generals has the largest gap between reputation and reality of any commander in the Second World War. One built a legend on a battle he couldn't lose, and one convinced the world he was the greatest, mostly because he said so louder than everyone else. The question is, which one was the most overrated? And the answer is going to make some of you very angry. If you want history that doesn't protect sacred cows, hit subscribe. This channel follows the data, not the myth. Now, let's put three legends on trial. Before we prosecute anyone, we need to understand something. Military reputations aren't built on battlefields, they're built on narratives, and narratives serve agendas. Take Rommel, the Desert Fox legend didn't start with the Germans, it started with the British. In 1941 and 42, the British Army kept losing in North Africa, and that created a political problem for Churchill. British generals couldn't explain why they kept getting outmaneuvered by a force that was smaller, worse supplied, and operating at the end of a supply chain that stretched across the Mediterranean. So, the narrative shifted. They weren't losing to an ordinary general, they were losing to a genius, an unstoppable force of military brilliance. If you lose to a genius, it's not embarrassing. If you lose to an average commander with chronic supply problems, that's a different conversation entirely. Churchill himself stood up in Parliament in 1942 and called Rommel a great general. Across the havoc of war, he said, a daring and skillful opponent. That's the British Prime Minister building the enemy's brand in real time, because it protects his own generals from scrutiny. Then there's Patton. Nobody had to build Patton's legend for him. He built it himself, the polished helmet, the profanity-laced speeches, the war face he practiced in the mirror. This was personal branding before anyone used the term. Patton understood media instinctively. He knew that perception creates reality, and he managed his image as aggressively as he managed his tank columns. In his private diary, the picture was more complicated. He wrote things like, "While my attack was going forward by short leaps, it was not very brilliant." That's the private Patton. The public Patton didn't do self-doubt. And Montgomery. His reputation was built on one battle, Alamein. Britain had been losing for 2 years. The public was exhausted. Churchill had just survived a motion of censure in the House of Commons after the fall of Tobruk. Britain didn't just need a victory, it needed a hero. Monty arrived in the desert, won a battle against an enemy that was already running out of fuel, and became a household name overnight. None of this is a conspiracy theory. It's just how the game works. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because now we're going to check the numbers. Let's start with the Desert Fox. Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941 with a limited mission. Hitler wanted him to defend a small area of Libya, prop up the struggling Italians, and keep the theatre as a sideshow while Germany prepared for Operation Barbarossa. Rommel ignored all of that. Within weeks, he launched an offensive that hadn't been authorized by the German High Command. He found weaknesses in the British defensive line and punched through them with the kind of improvisation that textbooks still study. By mid-April, the Afrika Korps had pushed over 1,000 miles east from Tripoli, reaching Sollum on the Egyptian border. The problem? Every mile of that advance made his supply situation worse. North Africa wasn't Europe. There were no factories, no railways, no local resources. Everything the Afrika Korps needed, fuel, ammunition, water, spare parts, had to be shipped across the Mediterranean from Italy, then trucked hundreds of miles across the desert to the front. The Royal Navy and the RAF controlled those sea lanes, and the further Rommel advanced, the longer and more exposed his supply lines became. His own superiors told him this. The Italian commander, General Garibaldi, warned him the supply situation was tenuous. The High Command sent General Paulus to North Africa specifically to restrain him. Paulus arrived and was reportedly appalled at how far Rommel had overextended. Rommel's response, documented in his own papers: "I had made up my mind to stand out from the start for the greatest possible measure of operational and tactical freedom." Translation: he was going to do what he wanted regardless of logistics. And this pattern repeated. Tobruk, Gazala, the push toward Egypt. Each advance looked spectacular on a map. Each advance burned through irreplaceable resources. By 1942, the Afrika Korps was so dependent on captured equipment that some sources estimate up to 85% of their transport vehicles were seized British trucks because Germany couldn't ship enough of its own across the Mediterranean. Then came El Alamein. By October 1942, Montgomery had assembled roughly 195,000 men against Rommel's 116,000. The British had around 1,440 tanks. Rommel had approximately 540, of which only about 210 were German medium tanks capable of standing up in an armoured engagement. The British had complete air superiority, and Rommel was so short on fuel that his vehicles couldn't manoeuvre. The panzer divisions that made him famous were effectively anchored in place. Now, Rommel didn't create all of these problems. The Mediterranean supply situation was partly beyond his control. But he made every single one of them worse by advancing when he should have held. German biographer Wolf Heckmann put it most directly. He called Rommel the most overrated commander of an army in world history. That's a German saying that about a German general. And here's the counterfactual that reveals the strategic problem. If Rommel had followed his original orders, held a defensive line in Libya, preserved his forces, and forced the British to attack fortified positions across empty desert, he could have tied down enormous British resources for years. Instead, his genius offensives ground down irreplaceable Afrika Korps veterans and delivered them to the exact battle, El Alamein, where their destruction was guaranteed. Now, to be fair, Rommel's tactical ability was real. His battlefield improvisation at Gazala in 1942, where he turned a near disaster into a sweeping victory, was genuinely exceptional. His ability to read terrain and exploit gaps in real time was elite. But tactical genius without strategic discipline is just expensive entertainment. And Rommel lost the campaign. But at least Rommel's problems were external: supply lines, sea lanes, an enemy with more of everything. The next general on trial had every advantage imaginable, and he still managed to produce one of the war's worst disasters. Bernard Law Montgomery arrived in North Africa in August 1942 and immediately started reshaping reality. He told his officers there would be no retreat. "If we cannot stay here alive, then we will stay here dead." It was stirring, it was dramatic, it was also unnecessary. His predecessor, General Auchinleck, had already stopped Rommel at the First Battle of El Alamein in July. The defensive position was established. The Qattara depression made flanking impossible. Montgomery inherited a situation where the geography was already doing half the work. What he did next was wait. For nearly 3 months, Montgomery built up his forces to overwhelming superiority. He refused Churchill's repeated demands to attack sooner. He drilled his troops. He accumulated tanks, including over 500 of the new American-built Shermans. He stockpiled ammunition and fuel until there was no conceivable scenario in which he could lose. Then he attacked. The Second Battle of El Alamein, October 1942. You already know the numbers: 2-1 in manpower, 6-1 in effective tanks, total air supremacy. The Eighth Army wanted for nothing. Rommel's force was starving. Montgomery won. Of course he did. The real question is what that victory actually proves about generalship. Churchill later wrote that El Alamein was a turning point. Before Alamein, they never had a victory. After Alamein, they never had a defeat. But historians have pointed out that Montgomery envisioned the battle as an attritional operation, more reminiscent of the First World War than of the mobile warfare that defined World War II generalship. He predicted the casualties and the timeline accurately, which means he planned a grinding match, not a masterstroke. And then came the pursuit, or rather, the lack of one. After El Alamein, the Afrika Korps was shattered. By the end of the battle, the Afrika Korps could muster barely 30 tanks fit for action against Montgomery's 600 plus. His motorized elements were retreating along the coast road, exposed, vulnerable, and out of fuel. A rapid pursuit could have destroyed the remnants of the Axis force in North Africa outright. Montgomery's pursuit was so cautious that the bulk of Rommel's motorized forces escaped. Historians note that the Eighth Army was surprised by the speed of the Axis withdrawal and slow to reorganize for pursuit. The Royal Air Force failed to mount a maximum bombing effort against the retreating columns when they were most vulnerable. Rommel pulled back roughly 700 miles to Elaghaila and lived to fight again. This pattern became Montgomery's signature: overwhelming preparation, methodical execution, sluggish exploitation. He rarely attacked without 3-1 superiority or better. His operations were meticulous in planning and frustratingly slow in execution. And then there was the one time he decided to be bold. September 1944, Operation Market Garden. Montgomery's plan to end the war by Christmas. Drop 3 airborne divisions across the Netherlands to seize a series of bridges, then drive an armored corps straight through to the Rhine. Audacious, ambitious, the kind of operation Rommel might have loved. It was a catastrophe. The plan relied on a single road for the armored advance, a road vulnerable to traffic jams and German counterattacks at every point. Intelligence had identified elements of 2 SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem, the furthest objective, but Montgomery dismissed the warnings. Eisenhower's chief of staff raised the concern directly. Montgomery refused to alter the plan. The result: Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed. Of roughly 10,000 men who landed at Arnhem, only about 2,400 were evacuated. Around 1,500 were killed. Over 6,000 were captured. The crossing of the Rhine was delayed by 6 months, and the Dutch civilian population north of the rivers endured the hunger winter of 1944-45, driven in part by a German retaliation for a railway strike called to support the operation, in which an estimated 18,000 to 22,000 people starved to death. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands is often quoted as saying, "My country can never again afford the luxury of another Montgomery success." Whether he actually said it is debated, but the sentiment captured what everyone on the ground already knew. The man famous for caution chose the worst possible moment to gamble, and when it failed, Montgomery wrote to the chief of the Imperial General Staff that the Polish brigade fought very badly, a claim that historians have since thoroughly debunked. General Sosabowski's reputation took decades to rehabilitate, but there's a defense of Montgomery that his critics often ignore. Britain in 1942 couldn't afford another disaster. The army had been beaten repeatedly. Morale was brittle. Manpower was finite. Britain simply couldn't replace losses the way the Americans or Soviets could. Montgomery's methodical approach preserved an army that had no margin for error. His insistence on superiority before attacking wasn't timidity. It was arithmetic driven by national survival. That's a legitimate argument, but it doesn't explain Market Garden. Montgomery was cautious when caution was convenient and reckless when his ego demanded a shortcut to the Rhine. Which brings us to the general who never let modesty interfere with a good story. George Patton entered combat in the European theatre in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. By May 1945, he was racing through Bavaria. In between, he built a legend that may be the most durable in American military history. The speeches where he told soldiers that no one ever won a war by dying for his country. You win by making the other poor fool die for his. Bastogne in the Snow. The Third Army's kill count. It's Hollywood material. Literally, George C. Scott won an Oscar playing him. But how much of that was Patton, and how much was just being American in 1944? Patton's most famous achievement, the Third Army's race across France in August 1944, covered roughly 300 miles from Normandy to the German frontier. He bragged that it was the furthest any army had ever advanced in history. It wasn't even close. At the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, German General Georg Hans Reinhardt covered over 500 miles toward Leningrad. General Otto von Knobelsdorff managed 800 miles in 6 weeks, a feat Knobelsdorff himself called unique in Prussian-German military history. And those advances were against the Red Army at something close to full strength. By August 1944, the Eastern Front had consumed Germany's best divisions for 3 years. Stalingrad and Kursk had broken the Wehrmacht's offensive power. What Patton faced in France was the wreckage, with total Allied air superiority clearing his path. The Lorraine campaign that followed tells a different story. To capture the province of Lorraine, an advance of only 40 to 60 miles, the Third Army required over 3 months and suffered casualties that some sources place around 50,000, a disproportionate share of the total losses the Third Army sustained in the entire European war, for a modest territorial gain against a German force that had time to prepare positions. Then there's the slapping incident. Sicily, August 1943. Patton slapped 2 hospitalized soldiers on separate occasions, men who were suffering from what we'd now call combat stress. He called them cowards. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It happened twice in different hospitals within a week. This matters not because it makes Patton a bad person, but because it reveals something about command judgment. A general who can't control his own behavior around wounded soldiers, his own men, raises questions about temperament under pressure. Eisenhower nearly ended his career over it. Patton was sidelined from combat command for nearly a year. He kept his rank partly because Eisenhower recognized his combat value, and later, in 1944, because the Germans feared Patton so much that he became invaluable as a deception asset for Operation Fortitude, convincing Hitler that the real invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. And the Battle of the Bulge? The Bastogne relief was genuinely impressive, reorienting an entire army 90 degrees, pivoting north in brutal winter conditions to relieve a surrounded garrison. That's a logistical and operational achievement that deserves respect. Patton's headquarters was the only Allied command that had started planning for the German counter-offensive before it happened. He grasped the situation faster than anyone else, But the broader Battle of the Bulge was won by the weight of Allied resources, not by any single commander's genius. The Germans ran out of fuel, Allied air power returned when the weather cleared, and the fundamental math of men and machines guaranteed the outcome. Now, here's where Patton deserves genuine credit. German generals, interrogated after the war, consistently identified him as the most operationally disruptive American commander in Western Europe. Not because of resources or air superiority, because of tempo, decision speed, the willingness to exploit a gap before the enemy could react. Even captured German officers expressed surprise at the speed of the Bastogne pivot. They hadn't considered it feasible. Patton's aggression saved lives by ending campaigns faster. His instinct for exploitation was perhaps unmatched in the Western Allied armies. And in his private moments, he was more self-aware than the public image suggested. During the Bulge, he wrote in his diary, "The Germans are colder and hungrier than we are, but they fight better." That's an honest assessment from a general who understood he was fighting with overwhelming advantages. Nobody disputes that Patton was good. The debate is whether good with massive advantages in a secondary theatre earns the word legend. So, 3 generals, 3 legends, and now the question that matters. Overrated doesn't mean bad. It means the legend outgrew the record. All 3 of these men were above-average commanders. So we're measuring whose mythology is most inflated relative to what they actually delivered. Let's work from least overrated to most. Patton comes in 3rd. The national mythology is oversized and his theatre gave him advantages that get understated. But underneath the brand, there was real operational skill, the kind that made the Germans single him out after the war. Lorraine and the slapping incidents are genuine black marks. But Patton's legend, while inflated, isn't hollow. Montgomery comes in 2nd. His caution was arguably rational, Britain's manpower was finite, and every division lost was gone for good. Alamein was necessary, but the mythology around it far exceeds the difficulty of the victory. That was competence, not brilliance, and Market Garden should permanently disqualify anyone from the conversation about great generalship. Which leaves Rommel, the most overrated general of World War II. The gap between the Desert Fox genius and the reality, a logistically blind tactical commander who repeatedly disobeyed orders, overextended his forces, exhausted an army that couldn't be replaced, and ultimately lost the North African campaign in significant part because of his own strategic incoherence, is the largest reputation gap of any World War II commander. And the legend was literally manufactured. British propaganda created it to excuse British defeats. Rommel's own self-promotion amplified it. And post-war narratives, the good German myth, the association with the July 20th plot against Hitler, cemented it into something that has very little to do with his actual military record. Give Rommel a single battlefield, a single day, and he was as good as anyone who ever lived. But war isn't a single day. It's logistics, it's sustainment, it's keeping an army alive over months and years. And on that level, the level that actually decides wars, Rommel failed catastrophically. But here's the part that nobody in this debate wants to hear. The real answer to who was the best World War II general probably isn't any of these 3. And most of you already know where this is going. Zhukov, who commanded fronts spanning hundreds of miles with millions of men against the bulk of the Wehrmacht. Rokossovsky, who survived torture in Stalin's Gulag and came back to plan Operation Bagration, the offensive that destroyed an entire German army group. Manstein, whose operational planning at Kharkov in 1943 may be the finest defensive counterstroke of the entire war. These commanders operated at scales and against opposition that dwarfed what any of our 3 generals faced, though the Western and Mediterranean fronts played critical strategic roles in forcing Germany into multi-front warfare. But the point stands. The generals we remember most aren't the ones who mattered most. They're the ones whose stories got told in English. And that's the final point about military mythology. It doesn't follow evidence. It follows language, culture, and who makes the movies. So here's what I want to know, and I want your honest answer. Forget the legends. Forget the documentaries. Forget what you were taught in school. Based purely on results versus resources, who was the most overrated general of World War II? Rommel, Patton, or Montgomery? Or is there someone else I should have put on trial? Drop your answer in the comments. Hit like if this changed how you think about any of these three. Subscribe if you want more history that doesn't protect reputations. Thanks for watching.